Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 128. On this podcast, I love to talk with people who combine their love of nature with their creative passions. Often it's through a traditional nature journal or a nature diary, and sometimes I chat with people who have a really unique way of capturing their impressions of nature. Today, I'm chatting with artist Meredith Woolnough. Meredith is from Newcastle here in Australia, and she uses freehand machine embroidery to create the most amazing sculptural representations of natural subjects. Meredith studied both textiles and natural history illustration, and keeping a nature journal is an important part of her creative process. In this conversation, we dive into the details of how Meredith researches, plans, creates, and displays her amazing pieces. You'll also hear about the role her sketchbook plays in generating creative ideas. Let's listen. Meredith, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very much looking forward to our chat today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to it as well.
So I always go back and ask about early childhood stuff, and I wonder if you can trace your creativity roots back to childhood.
Oh, I can try. I think I had a very lucky and privileged childhood in that my parents, my family were always very open to creativity. We were always doing something that was painting or drawing or playing with clay or colored yogurt. There's photographs of me smearing colored yogurt all over boards in the backyard. Probably ate most of it. But that was always a big part of what we did, and we were always quite, I think, connected with nature. We had a lot of camping holidays, and we had a decent backyard, and lots of memories of climbing trees and having little adventures even in our small sort of suburban block. So it's always been an important part, I think, of what we have. Probably something that I didn't appreciate until now, looking back.
Yeah, I think that nature experiences in the Australian backyard is actually a really big part of people's childhoods, and something that you don't really label back then. It was just what kids did.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of space around us, don't we? And just the regular suburban backyard is actually quite a wonderful place to make a nature connection in early childhood.
Yeah, absolutely. I have so many fond memories of like nestling into flower beds and climbing up trees and, collecting leaves and crunching leaves. And, you don't realize how important that little tiny world of your backyard is to your childhood and your experiences growing up. And you don't realize that not everybody has that.
Yes, yes. I have a friend who's from Germany, and she describes the European experience as caged hens, and in Australia we're free ranging.
I like that, but we're all chickens.
Yeah, that's right. Just because we have more space than many people in the world, which we need to remember as a good privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then when you finished high school, you went straight on to study art, and I wonder if that was just always a natural thing that you knew you wanted to do.
I think yes and no. I feel like when I finished high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do at all. And it was really scary to think we had to choose at that point.
Yeah.
So little life experience. And I'd always loved art. I was always so interested in it. So I, kind of put in my uni preferences and got accepted into art school. I had no plans of being an artist. To me, that seemed so lofty and unrealistic, not a real job. But I just wanted to learn more about it. I wanted to learn to make all the things and do all the things because that's when I was happiest, and I kind of liked it and was good at it. So yeah, jumped into art school. I was 17 at the time. I wasn't even old enough to go to the pub.
And what was the experience of art school like for you?
I think looking back on it, it was all a bit of a blur in good and bad ways. I really kind of went through it. I actually messed up my enrollment, and I had plans to go in and major in photography, but somehow managed to stuff that up and ended up not being able to do that. And as a result, I chose to major in textiles, which I knew nothing about. I hadn't done any sewing, or we didn't do textiles at high school, but it was an area that interested me because it seemed to have so many areas. It was so broad. It wasn't just painting, you go and paint, ceramics, you go and make ceramics.
Yeah.
Textiles was weaving and dyeing and basketry and fabric, and it was all sorts of things. And I went to art school because I wanted to learn all the things. So I ended up majoring in textiles, and it was probably one of the best happy accidents that ever happened to me, because I kind of found my thing through those studies and through those years at uni.
Yeah, so that sounds like one of those times when some sort of twist of fate, some sort of universe gift uh,
Yep.
changes your trajectory onto the path that you were supposed to be on.
Yeah, it could well be. Could well be. So yeah, definitely a happy accident. It's where we ended up, and don't regret it at all.
And through that, you've developed this really unique way of making art.
Mm.
So you call it freehand machine embroidery, but there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into it. And I wonder if you could paint a visual picture of what your process looks like and what your outcome looks like when you create a piece with freehand machine embroidery, what it comes out to be.
So yes, I guess my practice in a nutshell, to try and describe it to someone who can't see it. So
Yes, this podcast format.
podcast, when you work in a visual medium, wonderful. So well, I guess if we talk about how I landed there, talking back to my studies.
Yeah.
So I I said I majored in textiles, and I spent all those years playing with all the things, but I definitely mastered none of them. And then I had the opportunity to do an honours year, and I decided to focus on freehand machine embroidery on water soluble fabric. So, freehand machine embroidery is essentially a way of drawing with your sewing machine. It's actually very simple and very basic. You turn all the settings of the machine off. So, it's just that needle going up and down, and then you move fabric around under the needle to do a drawing. So, I saw that as a really cool way to draw. And I still think of my work as drawings just done with needle and thread. And then I thought that was very fun. But then I discovered water soluble fabric, which is a common embroidery stabilizer. It's mostly used to back fabric when you stitch onto it to give it more support. And then being water soluble, it can be washed away. So it allows you to stitch a beautiful drawing onto perhaps an otherwise challenging or delicate fabric, and then wash it away and you never know it was there. But I decided to use it as a base fabric all on its own, so that I could do my stitch drawing and then wash the fabric away. So essentially create an embroidery and then remove the base fabric altogether. So I just ended up with this sculptural stitched drawing. So I refer to it as sculptural embroidery because it's a more three-dimensional way to create things. So that year when I first started playing with it, I really just dove in with an experimental hat on and made all the mistakes and tried all the things, and really developed many of the ways that I work today. And I went in with very little guidance. I really didn't know much about it. I didn't know my way around a sewing machine. And as a result, a lot of the ways that I work are probably quite different to anyone else who has a background in textiles or sewing, because I didn't have any of those habits or preconceived ideas. I just approached it as a weird way to draw and an interesting way to create art, fell in love with it, and have been working with it for now, oh, over 15 years, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that you went into textiles partly by accident. But now, I mean, you describe it as drawing, but it is very much a sculpture when it's finished. And so you're interweaving all these different parts of art making, and the result is astonishingly beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I definitely see it as sculptural. Well, thread is sculptural anyway,
Yeah.
and that's why I love drawing with thread. Drawing on paper is fabulous and a huge part of my practice as well, but it's flat. It's a drawing on a flat surface, generally with flat mediums. But thread is three-dimensional to begin with,
Mm.
and then to be able to take it off the fabric, and then to be able to shape and mold it, to layer it. Because I did discover as well the base fabric that I can use acts almost like a glue. So it's not just dissolving it and making it into a flat or a floppy piece of fabric. You can
Mm.
shape it and mold it and create three-dimensional forms with it. It's very exciting. There's so much that can be done with it. I actually feel that the way that I work is really quite narrow. I've just sort of found my aesthetic and what I like to do, but it's only one tiny slice of the whole pie of possibilities, what you can do with this technique.
I love also when it comes out, and because it's three-dimensional and you often display your pieces against a white background, the shadow becomes almost part of the art piece, doesn't it?
Yes, hugely. The shadows are so important. That was also something that I developed quite early on, the way that I mount and present the works, because I
Mm.
was finding I was creating these beautiful sculptural pieces, these embroideries that were essentially liberated from their base cloths. And then when it came to displaying them, to put them flat again, to
Mm.
you know put them back on a board or something, they lost all that magic and that sculptural wonder. So I spent a lot of time sort of developing a way to display them, and I actually took inspiration from entomological collections, so sort of insect specimens and how they're all pinned out
Pinned.
and spaced. And it's quite a simple process, but it means that I can make my embroideries look like they're floating in the frame. I call it shadow mounting for the reason that when they're floating, they cast these lovely shadows, and it shows off the delicate lace-like nature of the work, or the negative space, and adds a whole nother dimension to the work as well.
Yeah. It must be quite a thing to create this piece with the machine and then to wash away the fabric and something new is in your hands. What does that feel like when you wash away the soluble fabric?
Oh, fun. It is my favorite part of the whole process because you get to see it come to life. It sort of goes from this flat embroidery on this white fabric, and then all the holes appear, and then it can shape, and sometimes it can kind of take on a life of its own. I often find if I'll stitch leaves, for example, they'll curl up just like real leaves
Mm.
will. They sort of
Wow.
take on their own life. Yeah, it's very much the exciting part for me, because that's the transformational part, when you're taking something away from the artwork, but you're also letting it come out.
Yeah, absolutely. I love thinking of you back in art school, just sort of finding your way through experimentation. And I'd love for you to tell me about taking your sewing machine into life drawing classes.
They hated me for that. Oh, yeah. So, in art school, you're always like, oh, yeah, I'll try and do something different. So, in art school, you do basic drawing classes. Pretty much everyone does life drawing classes, and you set up your big board and your paper and your charcoal. And I remember saying, like, look, I'm starting to play with this freehand machine embroidery. Would you mind if I brought a sewing machine into the classroom? And the teacher was all for it. He was like, oh, that'd be amazing. Yeah. But I'm sure all the other students hated it, because it wasn't like a constant droning. It was like a start, a stop, a word, a clunk, and I can't say that anything that I produced with the sewing machine in those life drawing classes was worth looking at. But it was a fun process. It was just also breaking free and loosening
Yeah.
up and trying to just draw in a different way, and not draw in a traditional way, because drawing is just making marks. I was just making marks with needle and thread. But yeah, all the other students were very polite about it. I'm sure they didn't really like the noisy machine, but they put up with it.
What an amazing thing though. I mean, I never went to art school, but I can imagine that art school is all about pushing boundaries and finding new ways to make marks and be creative, and that certainly is a unique, wonderful way to do
I don't know if anyone's ever attempted it since. I wouldn't
it.
even recommend it, but it was good fun. It was a good activity to try, and it's always great to try new things. You never know what you'll discover.
Lots of your work involves very, very fine, meticulous detail. And I'm really always interested in the way people work and what they produce through their art and whether that reflects their personalities. Do you find yourself to be at very close attention to detail in your everyday life? Is that the kind of person you are?
I think in some ways, I think I'm quite process driven. I'm quite
Mm,
practical. I think that comes from my father. He was a carpenter, but he was a very good carpenter. He would always do things beautifully and very well, and he always had the cleverest, most efficient way to do things. He was always very organized, and I think that kind of rubbed off on me, and that definitely informs my practice. It's not always so much intuitive and free and experimental, although that's very fun.
mm.
It's quite planned, and yeah, attention to detail, and having a process to follow works for me and it works for my work. So I think that comes across. Whether or not other aspects of my life reflect that, I don't know.
And so a lot of people listening from the nature journaling community will have done the short course that's offered by University of Newcastle, which is in natural history illustration. And you actually did their degree in natural history illustration. I'd love to hear about your experience with this.
Oh, yes. Well, I can't talk highly enough about that degree. It was actually also a bit of a happy accident that I stumbled upon it and ended up enrolling in it. So
Tell me about that.
how I got to that degree is I am originally from Sydney, did my fine art degree down there, and I was following art school. I went on and did teaching, which I loved. It wasn't a fallback for me. Like I said, I wasn't really
Mm.
thinking, "Oh, art is a serious career. I can't do that." Even though I loved it and I was exhibiting and I was selling work. And then I had the opportunity to move to where I live now, which is in Newcastle, about 2 hours up the road. And I moved up for a great reason. My now husband is up here, living up here, so I moved up to be with him. But it meant that I left my very stable full-time teaching job, and as a result of that, I was like, look, I want to focus more on my art practice and I want to get better at drawing because I felt that it was a big barrier for me. I had studied fine art and I had done my drawing classes, my life drawing with my sewing machine and all of that. But I still felt that I wasn't that great at it. I couldn't get the ideas out of my brain through my hands into my work. And I found, that was a real barrier for me. So I wanted to get better at drawing. And my work had naturally kind of morphed into exploring natural structures. I was looking at
Mm.
coral a lot in my embroidered works and really struggling to get, good ideas and references to translate into my stitched embroideries. So I was like, I'm going to study drawing. And I just thought I'd do like a little course or something. And then a series of serendipitous circumstances, I kept hearing about this natural history illustration degree. I would bump into someone at the shopping checkout and get chatting to them, and they were doing the course and they'd rave about it.
Oh,
Or
wow.
someone would come to my exhibitions. I had an exhibition in Newcastle of my embroidered work, and they were like, have you heard about this natural history illustration degree? Because it just aligns so well with what you're doing. So I looked it up and it sounded amazing. It was this wonderful mix of art and science. But I was like, I don't want to study another degree,
Yes.
you know. But I went and spoke to the course coordinator and like, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. Do you think this course is suitable for me? And it all sounded great. So I enrolled and I dove into it and I just found I found my place and I found my
Mm.
people because it was, like I said, that wonderful mix of art and science. And it was art school without all the egos. It was just people who were passionate about nature and about drawing, and the level of work that the students produced were amazing. And it wasn't in a nasty competitive way. It just encouraged everyone to work harder. And yeah, it was a wonderful degree. The people who ran the course were amazing. And they're, I believe, the same people who run that online course that the
Okay.
university offers, Bernie and Andrew. Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. So I learned botanical illustration, entomological illustration, medical illustration, all these particular disciplines, but also many other ways to approach and use drawings for things like illustrations for children's books or whatever direction you wanted to take it in. Also sculptural work too. So I had a fabulous time exploring that, and so much of the work and the practices that were explored in that degree have found their way into my own work, especially the field work, the research, the looking at nature really closely, understanding it well, and then knowing how to interpret that and develop my own designs that now feed into my embroideries. So, yes, I obviously loved it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that, the way that you take that, what you learned from that degree, and incorporate it into your current art practice, and specifically uh, the field work. And so I've heard you say that that field work, that research, and getting to know the species that you're working on really helps you create something more significant than if you were just working from a photograph or without that background connection with the species. I'd love to hear about your process and practice of fieldwork and how that helps you create something more significant?
Sure, sure. Well, I guess there's many different ways that I can find like a starting point for an artwork, but field work is one of my favorite ways to, of course, do it. We all love to get out into nature, whether it be a bushwalk or snorkeling. I love to scuba dive. It's a great excuse to go on holidays to amazing locations. So it's really nice to have those firsthand experiences and to find something that gives you that little spark that
Mm.
interests you. Quite often it's just a matter of going out and finding something interesting, and you don't have to go far. When I was creating work, I had, young daughter, a new baby. Pretty much all my work and all my journaling work were just house plants around my house or things within the block radius, the little walk that I'd go on when I was trying to get my kid to sleep. So you don't have to go very far to find inspiration, but then I quite liked, again, that meticulous approach of, if I found something, it interested me, I then want to know all about it, because I find the more you know about something, the more you want to learn about something. Curiosity kind of feeds this beast,
Yes.
and it's this wonderful cycle of, oh, that's interesting. What is it? The more you find out about it, you find out all these other fascinating things, or about the wonderful connections that that plant or animal has with other things in its environment, and it really enriches it. I like to think that you want to become friends with your subject, and you want to know them well before you try to interpret them. And then my stitched interpretations, they're not necessarily, botanically realistic interpretations of a plant that I find, for example, but it's definitely, all of my research really helps to inform what I do. Often I'm drawn to something because there's something about it that I find fascinating. It might be its structure or its color or something visual, and then I'll find more about that and learn more about that, and that definitely will help me to, when it comes to creating a stitched interpretation or a design that will work with my style of embroidery, the focus is often on those things that first drew me in. But I find my research helps to inform the design so that it's more accurate, more true, um, to the original specimen or the species, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, you often spend many, especially with a big piece, you spend many, many hours with that one particular species. And so it being your friend, it being something you've studied and researched and feel connected to, that must make that whole process more fulfilling for you.
Definitely. And it also just makes it easier to draw as
Mm.
well.
Yeah.
Quite often, you'll find for example, at the moment I'm working with coral fans a lot. I'm creating an exhibition focused on coral. And it's sometimes hard to find really great photos of, these sorts of things. Underwater photography is hard. I know, I've tried it. I'm terrible. So it can be, you find something beautiful and interesting, then you find out what that species, or maybe not necessarily the species, maybe just the genus. You find out more about it. You collect together a whole lot of different reference images. You start to notice the similarities or the differences between the structures. You start to draw them. You start to understand them. And then when it comes to developing my own artwork, if I want it to be a particular size or in a particular format, I can, once I've developed that good understanding of the structure of how that particular coral genus works and what makes it look like that particular genus, then because I'm friends with it, I know it so well, I'm comfortable with it, I've spent so much time with it, I can then essentially develop my design that will not only look good and look balanced as a design, but will also be true to that particular coral species. So it's a very freeing way to be able to develop your own designs. And that was really the missing link that I was looking for when I went back and studied drawing. I wanted to be able to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, didn't want to rely on taking a photo and using that as my pure source. I can essentially understand how this thing grows and works and functions, and then develop a design that is true to it, but also gives me the outcome that I want for my own work.
Absolutely. And this is that place where science and art play together. And I just think that's a wonderful space and so rich. And the way that artists can interpret science and take that to people is really wonderful. You did some work where you were creating embroidered
Yeah.
cells, which is quite wonderful. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, that was a really fun project that just kind of landed in my lap. It sounded like a dream project. So I was approached by this group that were working with cell culture research. And just as a promotion for, them, they decided to find artists and pair them with scientists that worked with cells. And again, pull out why these scientists loved cells, why they loved working with cells. And then we were just asked to create an artwork in response to that. There were no limitations on it,
Mm.
essentially do whatever we liked. So I got paired with this lovely artist who worked with embryonic cells, and she had these beautiful images of the cell cultures that she was working with, these wonderful colored shapes that looked like alien, out of this world things, so different from what I was used to seeing. I'd never really dived into the microscopic world, but
Yeah.
there's a lot there. It's pretty amazing. So from working with her and understanding what she did a bit, which again, something I'd never really explored, and also hearing how excited and passionate she was about it, how excited she was the first time she saw cells and things like that. So ended up creating basically a recreation almost, or my interpretation of one of her images, which was a very early cluster of embryonic cells. So it sort of just looked like this amazing glowing ball of green blobs, essentially. And she explained all the various parts to me. And then, yeah, I set about creating my own stitched cells, ended up creating hundreds of these little cup shaped embroideries and arranging them all together in a way that sort of referenced that original image. And it was a really fun project. I'd never worked collaboratively like that
Mm-hmm.
before. It was a really challenging project because quite often, I'm very particular about choosing my subject that I know will work well with this type of embroidery and give me a good outcome. But with this, I had no idea what I was walking into. I had no idea who I was going to be paired with, or what they were going to work with, or what the imagery that I had as inspiration would be. But it all worked out, and it was challenging, but really fun and fulfilling as well.
Oh, what a joy. What a joy to have that creative collaboration and then also have the chance to explore a new subject,
Mm.
something that was really fascinating, but that you might not have been drawn to otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's always good to push the limits. I think we can get very comfortable, and there's nothing wrong with being comfortable. And having such, my work is probably quite distinctive. You
Mm.
instantly see it and know it's mine. You know that I stitch coral, I stitch leaves, sometimes shells, and I don't branch too far out from those subject matters. There's still lots to explore there, but it's also really good to push yourself in new directions too. You never know what you'll discover along the way.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your subject. So, coral, leaves, and shells are strong features in your work. But I'm really interested in how your landscape informs that. So you live by the sea, you've got bushland nearby. I'd love to hear about the natural places that you visit regularly and whether that's what's informing those subject matters, or is the subject matter come from just what's going to look good in this using this sculptural technique?
Great question. It's probably a bit of both. Definitely inspired by things that are around me. Like I said, I do like to go out and do the field work, do the exploring, but it doesn't always have to be local. Here in Newcastle, I am a bit spoilt. We do have some beautiful areas, and many of the eucalyptus leaf specimens, for
Mm.
example, things that I've created are just things that I have found. I've just picked them up on the ground and worked with those. Some of my other leaf sculptures, as I've mentioned, might just be houseplants, plants with interesting veining patterns, or things that I've seen in botanical gardens. Sometimes, I've been traveling around for work, teaching workshops, and if ever there's a botanical garden, I will find it and I will spend a lot of time there and take a lot of photos. They also come with handy nameplates, which makes the research and identification much easier. Lots of variety in one place. So I'll often go to places like that. I'm not sort of strictly wanting to work with Australian natives, as beautiful and
Mhm.
wonderful as they are. I'm often more drawn to the structures themselves. When it comes to things from the ocean, yes, I live near the ocean. It's amazing. I'm too far down the coast, though, to have the kind of coral that I
Mhm.
particularly like to work with. There's some beautiful sponge gardens nearby that I like to dive with, although I've never explored those in my work. Often, if I will get to go on a holiday, it'll be somewhere where I can do some lovely tropical diving, and that always sort of fills my bucket back up with inspiration and ideas. It's just really nice to see that kind of environment. So that's often where I'll get sort of the starting points, or at least the inspiration points for certain things. But it doesn't always have to rely on just things that I have seen myself. Obviously, there's a world of wonderful things out there, and you don't need to experience in person to be inspired by them. So quite often it'll be things that you discover online, and then you research them further, or particular plants or animals that I've never encountered in real life outside of aquariums or museums. that are still really inspiring and fun to explore. So yeah.
That's true. I some time ago got invited to do a commission making some interpretive signs for a reserve in the USA, and so I was drawing and discovering things about the plants and animals there, and I feel very connected to those species even though I have never seen them in person. I look forward to one day spotting them in the wild, and because you take the time to draw and get to know them, I know that they will be instantly recognizable to me as old friends when I do see them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We tend to find our favorites. And I think as well, when you spend time studying, looking at something, whether it's something you chose or something for another project like work, and you build that connection, even the simplest and possibly overlooked plant is still fascinating. Even the weeds, that are growing in the cracks in the pavement can be really, really interesting. So
And it's interesting when you put down marks and you spend time like with the shadows and the colors and the textures of one particular animal, how familiar you become with that species. I remember I did a commission painting a superb fairy wren, and I'd never seen one in the wild. But I spent hours with this, with photographs of this species and the male and the female. And I was taking a walk really close to my home one day, and across my vision, really fast, came the female superb fairy wren. And I was like, oh, there she is. Like, I knew her from the colors and the texture of her breast, and I knew he was coming somewhere, and I was like, yes, my friends are here. It was more than that. It was almost like a celebrity sighting. It was like, oh, here they come.
oh my goodness, superb fairy wrens are my favorite bird of all time. Like,
They're amazing,
I
aren't
just
they?
love them, but they're so hard to spot, aren't they?
Yeah.
Or you'll spot them from a mile away, you'll never get
Yeah.
close, you'll never be able to get a good photograph of them, but they're such a joy to watch, and oh, they're so adorable. Yep, I know
Yes.
exactly what you mean. Yep.
So, one thing that I'm fascinated by in your work is color, because some of your work has just the richest color, but also you seamlessly blend colors one into another. And I would love to hear about how you're connected with color, but also just the technical side of how do you blend when you're drawing with your sewing machine? How do you blend the threads into each other so beautifully?
Great question. And it's something, yes, I'm glad that you noticed that, because that is something that I strive to really capture in my work, because as you know, I kind of came from this fine art background, drawing and painting, where you could mix up any color that you want and then any tint or shade of that color, so you can have so much control over it. But when you come to working with embroidery threads, you can only work with the colors that the threads come in. And although they do come in a beautiful range of colors, hundreds of colors, it's rare to get the perfect color and the perfect shade of color to perfectly match something. So there's always a bit of artistic license there. And then again, it's that problem of blending them. I didn't like in embroidery how you'd have that real obvious shift from one color to another. It would literally be like one color starts and one stops, and it was quite jarring. So I actually sort of accidentally discovered a way to color blend, or a way that works for me. And it might sound really obvious to anyone else who embroiders, but it was the discovery for me. I actually had my tension set incorrectly. I had the tension set too tight, and I was working with two different colors. So one color in my top thread, one color in my bobbin thread. You always have two threads going on when you're sewing. They get locked together to form your stitches. And because my tension was too tight, I was pulling that bobbin thread up to the top. So I'd have little bits of the top thread color, but little dots of the bobbin color coming through. And at the time I was working with black and white, and it made the whole piece kind of look like a bit more of a mottled gray. So I sort of thought,
Yeah.
oh, this is fun. It's almost like a pointillistic painting, what the Impressionists used to do. They'd put all those little dots of colors down. You look up close, it looks like a mishmash of nothing, but then you step back and your eye blends it all together. So I set about purposely doing this.
Yeah.
I sort of found a way that I could fine tune my tension to get the blending of the two different colors, my top and my bottom thread, as close as I could, to give me that sort of mix of both of them. And then it's really just, again, a process, a very pragmatic way that I put down my colors, and chopping and changing my top and my bobbin thread, so that if I start off with one color, I have several sort of blending modes where I sort of stitch through, changing the top and bottom color so that I can get a somewhat seamless change between the colors. And it can work really beautifully with colors that are close together, sort of colors that are close on your color wheel, like if you're blending through oranges and
Mm.
yellows. But it also works with very different colors. I've got pieces where I've done sort of border lily pads that fade from lime green through to like a plummy purple, two
Wow.
very different colors, both in terms of the color and also the tone of the color, very bright to very dark. But it still works. It still has that seamless, somewhat seamless change, as seamless as it can be when you're mixing two very different colors. So it was a very important part of my process and something that I strive to incorporate in many of my works. And although it's a lot of thread changes and a bit of a planning process, I think it's absolutely worth it. The
It works so well. And I love even you use lighter threads to make it look even more three-dimensional on some
yeah.
pieces, where in the middle you're using lighter threads, and then it even turns it into a sculptural effect where the highlights are even more defined.
Yes, definitely. That's something that I definitely employ in some of the shell pieces. So, sort of interpretations of nautilus shells and things like that, where, yes, exactly like you said, around the edges, it's a more richer, deeper orange fading into more yellows in the center. So, even though the piece itself, it might be curved because I can shape and mold them, it's a
Yes.
very shallow curve. So, to make, yeah, exaggerate that effect, yeah, how you lay down the color, just like you would with regular drawing or painting,
Yes.
because this is just drawing with threads.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you wonder about the world seeing color as a highlighted feature of what you experience? Is that a big part of your life?
Probably unconsciously,
Yeah.
you always get drawn to certain things. And one thing about working with embroidery thread, quite often embroidery threads come in very intense colors. They're those really pure primary
Yes.
colors. There are, of course, more muted pastel tones, but that tends to not be what I'm drawn to. So quite often my works are larger than life or brighter than true things, and they're almost candy colored. Uh, and that's because of the materials that I work with, or the materials that I have to work with, and they're also just the colors that I'm drawn to. So even if they're
Mm.
not purely realistic, I don't think that's a problem as long as they're joyous.
Yeah, absolutely. Your work is joyous 100%. I think that's a great word to describe it. It
Thank you.
it blends art and nature, but also it gives you a feeling of like wonder, and that's partly the colors, but also the textures and the forms and just this the shadows. The whole thing is wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I really hope that if people see my work, it makes them curious, because so often people look at it, and if they're not familiar with embroidery, because it's not embroidery presented in the way that they're used to
Yes.
seeing, people can't figure out what it is, and so
Yes.
they're drawn in to look closer and to try and understand it, and then perhaps to understand what the structure is, what is it inspired by, and that's so much part of my practice, going into nature, finding things, looking closely at them, understanding them. So if my work can spark curiosity in people, either about the embroidery technique or about the natural things that inspired them, I feel like it's done its job.
Absolutely. So, some time ago, you set yourself the task to create 100 pieces, and this was the 100 embroideries project, and it was highly ambitious, but the final product is amazing. Do you want to talk about this project?
Oh, it was also highly ambitious because I was on this tight timeline. I was actually I was pregnant with my second daughter,
Wow.
and having being my second, I knew what I was in for. So I I I had this solo exhibition booked, and it was in the early stages of the year, and I was like, okay, this might be my last exhibition for a while because new baby, and I want to do something different, and I want to push myself, but also maybe not something too crazy. So I had this idea to do these 100 pieces, all about the same size, and I did the maths, and I was like, yeah, so that's maybe a couple of pieces a week. I think I can do that. So it sounds, oh yeah, just make 100 pieces. And that's fine until you run out of ideas. But it was so good because, again, wanting to go back to those sort of early experimental days when I was first learning and first playing, I was trying all these different things, and that was very freeing. And since then, I felt like I got a bit set in my ways.
Mm,
And like I said, I'm known for stitching coral and leaves, and I had these very particular motifs that people will instantly recognize as mine, but I wanted to give myself an opportunity to explore beyond that. So although I definitely, throughout the 100, definitely included all of those sort of iconic things, my ginkgo leaves and the coral and all of those sorts of things. It gave me the opportunity to explore other things and drawings just for the sake of drawing. So there's some that are just colorful rainbow explorations of structures. Others are, other plants and animals that I've never done before. So I think there's a butterfly in there. And it's funny because whenever I teach a workshop, there's always someone that decides to make a butterfly, and it's always
Is this a really hard
no,
thing
no,
to?
no. It's something
Okay,
that people just naturally go towards because butterflies are great.
because they're beautiful and
They're
colorful.
awesome.
Yeah,
But I'd never made one, and it was always a
yeah,
joke in my class. As soon as a student would be like, "Oh, my idea for my project is to make a butterfly," I'd be like, oh, "Guess what? You won the butterfly award." There's always one in every class, and it was always a joke. Why don't they're a bit of a joke in my workshops? I've
yeah.
never made one, so I finally made a butterfly. I also did my first bird, which was actually a superb fairy wren. Fair
Yes.
enough, just a little black silhouette of one. So I haven't explored those things since, but it was a great excuse to do so. So it was a really fun project. It was challenging, but it was so nice to see it come together and so nice to see them all exhibited together.
Yes, they look beautiful all together. So you mounted them in the same sort of frame, and they just come together to make such a cohesive collection.
Yeah, and that's a big thing when you're working in a big series like that. I couldn't just make 100 random pieces because I
Yes.
wanted them to be displayed in order, and I also wanted them to look like I had the idea of the grid, the 10 by 10 grid of
Yeah.
pieces. So I planned it out that because a lot of my designs are circular. That probably comes from the fact that I work in an embroidery hoop and I like circles. They're nice. So every second piece was a circular design, and then the in-between pieces were more of a free form, a branch, a bird, a butterfly, whatever. And then I had to balance out the whole series so that it wasn't like a cluster of coral in one corner or a
Mm,
whole heap of blue pieces in another corner. I was always not just making 100 pieces, but planning out
the
so that
whole.
the whole series worked together and it looked balanced and it looked cohesive and all of that. So it was this big juggling act. It was like putting a puzzle together, but you didn't have all the pieces yet.
Yes.
You didn't even have any idea what some of the pieces were going to be. But yeah, it was very fun. And it's funny that you should bring up that project because I'm actually working on a small book about that project at
Oh,
the moment,
fantastic.
putting together because it was such a popular series and they all sold out at the
Wow.
exhibition in record time, which was kind of amazing. And so I wanted to sort of bring them all back together. So I'm actually just in the process of putting together a book about the 100 Embroideries project to kind of bring them all back together again. So
How amazing. One thing that I love about this project, because myself and most of my listeners are all about the sketchbook.
mm,
I heard you talk about this project, and that because you did so many, and because you were exploring your favorite motifs, but also like looking for other things and more inspiration, that you went back to your old sketchbooks and trawl through them and just get re-sparked from your old sketchbooks. And I remember I did art in high school, and my teacher was always talking about keep a visual diary, keep everything in it, it will be so valuable later. And I never really got that until later, just how valuable that is. And I'd love for you to talk about that, like revisiting your old sketchbooks and getting re-sparked by the things you'd put there.
oh, absolutely. I know what you mean. I feel sometimes we're so keen to just jump into the
Make
artworks.
the thing,
Yeah,
yeah.
and we sort of forget about how important and also how enriching that process
Yeah,
of sketching is. So quite often, you'll sketch down ideas and then they'll never happen, or they won't happen for years. They'll just be those starting points. They're not quite there yet. You don't have enough information, or it's not working yet, or you don't have the skills perhaps yet to bring them to life in the way you want. So they just get put in a drawer. And then with my own practice, there were things that were working, there were things that people were asking me for or commissioning, and I was very much going in those directions. But there were obviously lots of other things that I'd played with, at least in the early drawing and sketching zones. So this was a wonderful opportunity to pull out those old sketchbooks, pull out the university fieldwork sketchbooks and discover species that I'd forgotten about and
yeah,
revisit them. And then I also had a designated sketchbook for the project as well that just went with me everywhere. It was just a little moleskin and it was just in my handbag with a pencil the whole time. And then whenever I was thinking of ideas or if I had a spare minute, I could just sort of sit down and roughly kind of sketch out. And the pages were small, so I knew that if it fitted neatly on the page, it would suit the scale of the 100
Yeah.
Embroideries project. So that was also a really good uh, process for me. The sketchbook from the 100 Embroideries project for me is probably more precious than any of the
Yes.
pieces in the project itself. And there are many pieces in that sketchbook that didn't make it into the project.
Interesting.
Might get made in the future, might not, who knows? But it's that wonderful resource that you can go back to and refer back to, and it's so valuable. I think my sketchbooks are, yeah, probably more precious to me than any of my works themselves, because so much of the discovery and the research and so much of the early initial stages are in those sketchbooks. I feel that by the time I get to the sewing machine, I'm essentially coloring in. I've done all the planning, I've done all the hard work in the drawing and design stages, and the sketchbooks are the impetus for all of it.
That's such an interesting thing to hear. And it's wonderful because as nature journalists, we're always talking about it's process, not product. And the process is where you make the connection. The process is where you deepen your understanding and do all the learning. And yes, you can create something wonderful that can then go out into the world and bring joy and, spark a conversation. But the process is what you carry with you. And that's the evidence of it on the page.
Yeah. And I think so often people don't see the process. Sometimes we're very reluctant to share our sketchbooks
Yeah.
because let's be honest, there's a lot of bad drawings in a
Yes.
sketchbook. That is exactly how they're meant to be.
Yes.
I do have some very beautiful polished sketchbooks that are really little works of art in themselves, where I've taken my best designs and my best drawings and my best notes about particular plants or animals and put them all together in a beautiful way. And that's just one type of sketchbook for me. That is very nice. That is probably, if you see photos of my sketchbook, I'm going to share that one. But
Yeah.
there are plenty of scrappy, messy, scribbled pages, and that's all part of the process as well. They need to be celebrated just as much as those really beautiful drawings.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you mentioned this before, but I'd love to dive into it a little bit, and that is balancing a creative career with motherhood. I know that this is a big challenge that I'm going through at the moment, and it's a joyful one, and at the same time, you want to dedicate yourself fully to both things, and you can't always do that. And I'd love to hear your experience of that.
Sure. Well, it definitely is a juggle. It is a balancing act. I don't know if anyone's got it figured out. I don't know if it can be fully figured out. But I find that for me personally, like I love being mum, love my kids, but I definitely still need
Mm,
that creative outlet. That's so much a part of who I am. I'm so much more than just being a
mm.
mum, as important and wonderful as that is. So I've always strived to have that balance. I never really stopped working. When I had my first daughter, I was in the middle of writing my book, which was probably a terribly stupid idea to take on while pregnant and then with a newborn. So I was always juggling that. And then, as I said, leading up to the birth of my second daughter, I had this big 100 Embroideries project, and I've always had, when my kids are young, they're in the studio with me. But it's about that balance. They're in the studio with me, but when they're awake, we're hanging out, we're doing baby
Yes.
stuff, we're
Yeah.
we're we're eating, we're whatever. And then when they would sleep, that would be the blocks of time that I could get my work done. And I sort of had my studio set up so that my studio's away from home. I need to go to work. That's
Mm, mm,
important
mm.
for me. So I would have a separate room with a porta cot, and we'd sort of go, baby would sleep, I'd do a bit of work, and then they wake up, we do baby stuff, and then the process continues. And I had to really reevaluate and adjust my expectations of myself. That was a really big thing, because I was used to, before kids, BC, before children, I was able to produce so much work. I was able
Yeah.
to stitch all day and I was able to churn through work. And then I just was not able to do anything like that once having kids. I just do not have the time. And even now, I've got the two girls. My eldest is in school this year and the youngest is in daycare 3 days a week. And so those 3 days are the days that I'm in the studio and doing work, but also, because my eldest is in school, I've got to pick her up. I've got to
Yes.
leave the studio at 2:30. So my workday got so much shorter.
Yes.
So, you just get into a new thing. Oh, I've got these 3 days and I know how much I can achieve in 3 days. And then you have to readjust the expectations again and learn that that's okay. It's okay to say no to things. It's okay But we also push ourselves, I think. And I know I definitely, sometimes in an unhealthy way, push myself too much, take on too much, have a hard time saying no. But it's also because I love it.
Mm-mm.
And I think it is important for your kids to see that, there is that side of you and that that's important. One thing that I've quite enjoyed this year, having my eldest daughter going to school during school holidays, she's with me all the time.
Mm.
So we go into the studio and she loves coming into the studio. And I don't expect to get much work done when I'm there. So we go in and she'll have a project that she wants to work with, something creative. It might be a little craft kit, or she wants to do a drawing or a painting. And we set her up on a table and I'll set up on another table. And I'll just it might be just drawing. It's generally for me, I'm not sewing when she's there with me. But, a drawing, we're designing, I might be mounting something. And then as soon as she doesn't want to be there anymore, we go home. And anything I can get done is a bonus.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
okay. Yeah.
I love what you said about readjusting expectations, because we can have this thing where we hold tightly to what we were achieving before, or what we dream or hope or expect to achieve, but bringing it back to reality is a good thing. But continuing, as you said, it's important for kids to see their mums, striving for something, creating something, being their own person. But I love also that, you wind it back and say, you talked about finding inspiration close to home on walks with your kids, or, you don't have to go to some grand place to find your subject matter. Sometimes it just means picking up a leaf in the backyard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance and what works for you and being okay with it, and also understanding that things change. And
Yeah.
that's okay too.
And this is a phase as well. And the next thing, you'll open your eyes one day, and then the kids will be off with their friends hanging out
Yep. Everyone
at the
keeps saying
train
that.
station. Yeah.
Everyone keeps saying, "Oh, it's so fast. It goes by so quickly." And when you're in the moment, particularly with young kids, you're kind of like, "Oh gosh."
Yeah.
But I've got a kid in school now. When did that happen?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
trying to trying to enjoy it, but also trying to not put everything on hold
Yes.
just because you're kids, because you can still do the things that are important to you.
Would you like to talk about your book? You mentioned it before. So you've written a book, Organic Embroidery.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, what year did I make that? When did I have my daughter? That's why my life's a blur. I think 2017, 2018. So I was approached to make a book and sort of had never really considered doing that, but thought what a bucket list thing to do. And I
Yeah.
definitely put all my heart and soul into it. So the book is sort of part sort of visual, inspirational sort of record of some of my favorite pieces and the stories behind them, but it also maps out my process in a way that you can learn more about what I do, but also take it on yourself if you're interested in that. So I talk through from sort of start to finish. I go through my field work and sort of my sketchbooks in a basic way, taking photos, how I develop my designs, and then the technical, I guess, how to on how I do my type of embroidery, and things like color blending and the different types of structures and things that you can use. So a lot of people like the book because it kind of shows them how they can do this
Mm.
type of very particular embroidery and gives them a good basis there. But then other people just like it because it's full of
'Cause
lots
it's
of pretty
beautiful.
pictures. Yeah, I wanted it to be both. I wanted
Yeah.
it to be multi-layered, and even now I read back over it and I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty proud of it. There's probably not much of it I'd change, even though my practice has sort of moved forward in the last 5 or so years since I brought it out.
So this is a technique that someone with a few tweaks could do on a home sewing machine?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You don't need a fancy sewing machine, just a normal sewing machine and a bit of patience and know-how and the right thread, and you're fine.
Amazing. So you and I, in fact, were featured in the same book very
Mm,
recently, and I think this is how we came to
quite
each other's
possibly.
work.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Social media, don't you love how the world connects you through that? Yep.
Yeah, so the book is called Create Naturally, and the subtitle is Go Outside, Rediscover Nature with 15 Artists. So the book was written by Marcia Young, and Marcia interviewed each artist, 15 of us, and then the book is beautiful in itself. It's got all sorts of lovely, rich photographs, and then the story of the artists.
Yeah, it was such an honor to be invited to be a part of be a part of that book. And it was such a nice process. Again, such a variety of artists, but all sort of linked by that
Through
spark
nature.
that comes from nature,
Mm-mm.
which is such a simple thing. And it's a thing that I think all of us are linked by, whether we think we are or not. So, yeah, it's a beautiful book.
I love what you said, that we're all linked through nature, and so it's so easy as as a city dweller or someone who's not got a regular way of connecting with nature to feel like there's nature over there and there's me here in the city, but that
Mm.
we just have to remember that it's one and the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think sometimes we see nature as a pest, like, oh, there's ants and
Yeah,
cockroaches in
yeah.
my apartment, and there's weeds growing where I don't want them to grow, but it's just nature doing its thing. We're just trying to make it our own.
Yeah. So let's talk briefly about sketchbooks and nature journaling. And I know that nature journaling and travel journaling are part of your life. I'd love to hear a little more about that, how the sketchbook and nature journaling in particular plays a role in your creative practice.
Sure, sure. Yes. So I really do love nature journaling. Although I think people find me and like me for my embroidery, the nature journaling is a big part of what I do. And I do often teach it whenever I get a chance as well. I really love it because I feel like, well, only certain people are drawn to embroidery, or you need a sewing machine. Anyone can draw, anyone can pick up a pencil and paper and enjoy that. And nature's such a great place to start with that, because I think when you draw something from nature, whether it be a leaf or a bird or whatever, it doesn't always have to look exactly like that thing. It just sort of has to feel like that thing. And then you can recognize it and you can be really satisfied with the drawing, which is such a big part of it. Because so many people are quick to say, oh, I can't draw, I'm not a drawer. And that's the
Yes.
barrier that stops them from even starting. But in my own practice, like I mentioned, I do like to do field work and go out and collect and sketch things. I also find drawing just to be one of the most centering and
Mm.
focusing and often relaxing things that I can do, particularly once you become comfortable or familiar with your subject, good friends with your subject. I quite like to sometimes just sit down and draw repetitive patterns of leaves, fill up a sketchbook page with certain leaves all nestled together, and those sorts of things definitely filter into my own work. So I do like to keep those sorts of journals, and I have varying levels of them. There's sort of the scrappy ones where there's a page here and a page there, and then there's those more purposeful ones where they're more considered, they're curated, their page is planned out so it's all balanced. You mentioned travel journals. Last year I was very, very lucky with my family to take 4 months out of our lives and travel around a bit of Australia in a caravan
Oh,
with
fantastic.
two kids under five. What a great idea. It was amazing, but also challenging. But my creative outlet during that trip was, I decided I wanted to make a travel journal, and it was a very purposeful thing. I wanted something that was creative, something that was for me, but also something that fed into the trip. So I had a beautiful little sketchbook, had my little fieldwork kit of pens and pencils and watercolors. And the whole way through the trip, I was always basically keeping a list of things that I wanted to include
Mm.
in that sketchbook. I would keep a list of the places that we'd go to, the things that we did, the things that we saw, and it was in my mind. So when I was photographing things, it might be an interesting plant or a bird or a building or a street sign or whatever, that I could have illustrated elements, but also essentially write a little bullet point style journal of the things that we saw and the things that we did. And so I ended up making this little book, and I would work on it when my youngest daughter was asleep, because the youngest would still take a day nap. So invariably one of us would have to sit in the caravan with her while she napped, and that was perfect for me
Yeah,
because
I'll do
me,
it.
me, 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 me. You go take the big one and go on an adventure. I want to sit and draw. And it was so nice to just have that break, because when you draw, you become so focused and in that lovely flow state. And, they were small, simple drawings
Mm.
and little notes. And I ended up creating this beautiful keepsake of the trip. And now when I flick back through it, it's like
Yes.
a time machine. You go back to not just the places you visited, but also the time that you were sitting down and drawing. And it triggers memories in ways that sometimes I feel photographs don't, because you're so connected when you're drawing something, because your whole body is involved in it in many ways.
100%. I love that you said it brings back memories of the time, but it also brings back memories of the process of creating it. And then that's such a rich experience that is completely evoked in full color detail when you look back at the pictures. I love that.
Mm, yeah, no. is really lovely. And then you have this wonderful thing, and even
Yeah.
my daughter's very excited about it. She loves to look through it and show other people. And yeah, we're not showing people photographs of our trip. We're showing people this little book, and
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
That's so special. Tell me about what's next. So you talked about working on a little book about the 100 embroideries project, and I think you're also prepping for a solo show later in the year. Is that right?
Yes, yes, I am. So in this balance of trying not to take on too much, I've probably taken on too much. So yes, like I mentioned, I do have that little book coming out of the 100 Embroideries project. It's just getting wrapped up now, so that'll be available if anyone wants their own little version of it. And then yes, I'm working towards my next solo show. So the 100 Embroideries project was the last solo exhibition I had back in 2020, and then I was invited back to the same gallery this year. And I was like, yes, I would really like that opportunity. But unlike past years, I don't have a backlog of work
Mm-mm.
to kind of bring along, and it's a really big space. So I'm really focused on that show at the moment. As I mentioned, it's coral focused because I'm just obsessed with coral. I just love it. I find it so interesting and I find it so beautiful. But I also found, particularly with the sea fans, which I am drawn to because they work so well with my technique, I didn't know that much about them. They're actually really hard to find out about them. They're not as easy to identify.
Interesting.
There don't seem to be as many, scientists writing about them. But I connected with another friend of mine did an amazing sort of traveling expedition a few years ago, where they did all this marine work went and stayed on a ship. It was amazing. And I went to a presentation about that and connected with the head scientist there. And she put me on to a scientist who had developed essentially a scientific field guide of sea fans, which is out of print, but I managed to pick up a copy. And I've just been nerding out on sea fans and learning all about them. And they're very complicated in their identification. It's often quite microscopic, but yeah, so fascinating as well. So I'm hoping that with this exhibition, I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to be an expert on sea fans, but I'm definitely using it as an opportunity to learn more about them and to, again, become friends with particular genuses and understand how they work and how they are structured, and then create my own stitched interpretations of those. So that's my focus for that show, and I'm really loving it. I'm so excited by it. I just hope I can make enough pieces to pull it off.
That's fabulous. I love that. Also, again, you're mixing science and art. You're making connections with scientists, and then, yeah, taking that work and interpreting it in your own way that will reach a different audience that never would have seen that book that the scientists created, but now that work is going to be reinterpreted in a colorful and artistic way.
I certainly hope so. And I really hope, because I think quite often you think coral fan is just one thing.
Mm-mm.
So by bringing to an exhibition that really highlights the similarities and differences between them, again, it just makes people curious. It makes people look closer and understand that there's so much more to our world than perhaps we initially see.
Amazing. Meredith, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much for your time.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Meredith. She did a great job of describing her artwork through this podcast medium, but it's a wonderful thing to see for yourself so that you can take in all the forms, shapes, and colours of the work. I invite you to go to the show notes of this episode and follow the links to Meredith's website where you can see her artwork in full colour and detail. If you're interested to find out more about the book that features Meredith and myself, as well as 13 other artists whose practice is connected with nature, it's called Create Naturally by Marcia Young, and you can find a link to that also in the show notes of this episode. I'm really interested to hear your experience combining nature and creativity in unique ways. You can write a comment under this podcast on the Journaling with Nature website. Have you ever tried embroidery or another way of using textiles in your creative practice? I'd love to hear about it. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.